All right.
So we're not going live with YouTube. It's just going to be recorded and it'll be uploaded later. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, then let's get this pony on the trail. I'm Richard Chasm. I'm the moderator this evening, and we have as guests, and Kevin Bell is running for House District 2 to serve in the state legislature. Ken Carloni is a past president of Umpqua Watersheds, and Stan Petrowski. Stan, you have been the president of Watersheds at one point, were you?
That's correct, for about 10 years.
And Bob Allen's an old-time agitator who sold out and went to Portland. He can hang out with his son, who's a serial salmon killer.
Oh, perfect.
Say hi to Chris for me. Tell him I mentioned him.
Yes, I'll do that.
So this is a town hall meeting where we're going to discuss the environment, but I think that the issue that is most meaningful to me, and I've been an activist and a loudmouth in this community for 40 years, but it's always been about the fisheries and restoring the salmon and keeping our salmon runs strong. And I think there's a linkage between forest management and the watershed and the fisheries. And increasingly, I've been advocating the restoration of the beaver as a connecting species between the forest, the water, and the fish. And so there's a lot of ramifications about reforestation, forest management, what the state does, what they don't do. But basically, what I hope we can talk about is how we can work to restore these fish runs. And as Betsy has said, how then you send some of the legislature with specific proposals. So, I know, Ken, you have been you have a degree in forestry, but you've been hanging out with subversives from the fishing community. So I'll throw the door open for your comments on this, Ken.
I was appreciative of Betsy's comment earlier before we started streaming that Kevin is running for a statewide position, and so discussions of federal forests are kind of peripheral, right? And so I will adjust my thoughts and comments to focus more on issues that a person in Kevin's position at the legislature could affect more than federal issues. I think that's and as Richard said, I'm essentially an upland ecologist, a forest ecologist, and my forte really is fire. But I have been spending time as the token upland ecologist with a group of fisheries folks, the Native Fish Society, Steamboaters, North Umpqua Foundation, the Conservation Angler, Trout Unlimited, and probably a couple of others that I'm forgetting right now. And what we've been focusing on quite a bit is the Rock Creek hatchery. And as most of you know, that burned down in the Archie Creek fire. And so there was an attempt to rear the summer steelhead salmon eggs down at the Coal River facility on the Rogue River. And those fish were the smolts, the young smolts were returned to the Rock Creek hatchery without filling out any of the appropriate paperwork. And we had been working really hard with the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And as folks may know, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the staff, are the staff folks that run the fisheries program and hunting licenses and hatcheries and fishing surveys and things like that. But it's the Fish and Wildlife Commission, a 7-person board that's appointed by the governor, that actually supervises, creates policy for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to carry out. And so we were able to convince. Well, let me back up a little bit. And there's this pervasive idea, and of course, this is hatcheries go back over a century. When salmon began to decline, humans decided that we could create technical fixes for that rather than dealing with the root cause of the problem. Spawning, spawning conditions, river conditions, estuary conditions, ocean conditions, and back again. They would just build hatcheries with the idea that more fish meant, more hatchery fish going out meant more fish returning. And what we've been seeing on the North Umpqua is that that is not true, that more hatchery fish don't mean more fish coming back. More hatchery fish mean more hatchery fish coming back. And so who cares? Why should we care? It turns out that even though hatchery fish, about half of the brood stock for the hatchery up at Rock Creek and hatcheries around the region, typically brood stock is collected directly back from the fish that come back to the hatchery, because fish come back typically to where they spawn. But it's kind of a shotgun situation. Some of them return to exactly where they were spawned, right? Swim right back into the hatchery. Others stray and will go off into other watersheds that are not their home streams, their natal streams. And then the other half of the brood stock are collected at the Winchester Dam, and from wild stock. And again, for folks that aren't really up on this, how can you tell a wild fish from a hatchery fish? And the answer is that all of the young, when the fish are hatched at the hatchery, they'll clip the adipose fin, that little tiny fin right before the tail. And so fin clipped fish, when they get to be yay big, you can still that fin is still missing. Doesn't seem to affect their performance at all. And so that's how you tell the difference between a hatchery fish and a wild fish. And so the problem with hatcheries and hatchery reared fish is that there's we're just beginning to discover, in the last decade or two, that we've all been taught in school that the genes that you inherit are the genes that are manifest in your outward appearance, right? Well, it turns out that environment can influence the expression of those genes. So it's not going to change the structure of the genes, but it's going to mean which genes get turned on and turned off. And being reared in concrete tanks with Purina trout chow is nowhere near the kind of environment that a wild fish would be raised in. And that causes epigenetic changes in those fish. Now, and you might say, okay, well, that's in the hatchery fish, and so we don't really care too much about that. But it turns out that those changes can last at least 2 generations. And so when those hatchery fish spawn with wild fish, the resulting offspring will have part of the genetics of the original wild fish raised in the wild, raised under all of the natural conditions, and part of the epigenetic changes that happen to the tank raised fish. And so what we found 2 years ago, we had the lowest return of summer steelhead ever, 450 wild fish total, out of tens of thousands that used to return.
No, excuse me, this is in the North Umpqua?
This is in the North Umpqua.
Okay.
Now this year's a little bit better because river conditions and ocean conditions were a little bit better. But the argument is, again, that more hatchery fish don't mean more fish returning. It just means that of the fish that do return, a greater percentage of them will be hatchery fish with those buggered up genes from those epigenetic changes. So clearly what's happening here is that it's what ecologists refer to as a carrying capacity issue. That is, there's only enough resources in the river and in the oceans and in the river again to support a certain number of fish. And so the number of wild fish and hatchery fish far, far, far exceed the number of returning fish. And so the one piece of evidence that was very convincing, so just to back up a little bit, the Oregon Department of, the staff, the ODF&W, recommended that the summer steelhead program continue. We presented data to the Fish and Wildlife Commission that convinced them to vote 4-3 to discontinue the summer steelhead program there. That was immediately sued by the county, by the Fish Derby, and by another guide. Again, with this mistaken idea that if you decrease hatchery fish, you'll decrease the total run of salmon. But when the winter steelhead hatchery program was discontinued in 1992, 2 years later, which is the out migrating and back in migrating cycle, 2 to 3 years later, winter steelhead began to increase, and they are now a very healthy run of fish with no help whatsoever from we humans. And so some very very smart fisheries biologists presented that information, those data, and a lot of supporting information to Fish and Wildlife Commission, and that was and they accepted it. At least 4 out of 7 of them did. And now there's an interesting, the lawsuit that's going on now is really challenging the authority of the Fish and Wildlife Commission over their staff at the ODF&W. And so it's interesting. There were just more arguments that were made last Thursday, and we'll see what the judge decides eventually. So I'll just put in one more quick note, and then I'll stop and let other people chime in. Richard was talking about the connection between the uplands and the fisheries. And of course, we all know that watersheds start at the top of the ridge, right? And all that water sooner or later makes it down into the river, or not, or gets lost from evaporation or pumped up into trees. And the issue there's lots of issues associated with clear cutting forests. That is, when an even age stand grows back in, it's far more susceptible to catastrophic fire than an old growth stand is. And the interesting thing is, it pumps out a lot more water into the atmosphere. Young plantations pump a lot more water out into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration than old growth forests do, or native stands do. And so not only were all those plantations doing that, and so water was becoming more and more scarce in the high gradient streams where salmon, particularly steelhead, spawn. That problem was only going to get worse. Now, what did the fires do? The fires created, the fires burned all of those. The vast majority of the plantation, certainly everywhere that fire hit that was a plantation, is mostly gone. And so on private land, they're mostly replanted. On public lands, they're partly replanted. All of those young plantations are going to be pumping a lot of water out of the ground. And so our argument to kind of pull that back into why that summer steelhead program should be discontinued there is that wild fish with wild genetics are going to have the best chance of surviving the fluctuations in conditions that we're going to be seeing over the next couple of decades as that forest recovers.
Wow. I do want to throw it open, but I want to ask you a couple of questions. I was following along here. You say there's a lawsuit that is occurring to challenge the authority of the Fish and Wildlife Commission to make decisions that the Fish and Wildlife, could you explore that a little bit? That's kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
the county and the fishing derby, the DTO's fishing derby, and another fishing guide sued to keep the Fish and Wildlife Commission from basically ordering the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to discontinue the summer steelhead program. Now that there's a much bigger question here, and that is rebuilding the hatchery at all. There are a couple of different proposals for that. One is to just keep the tanks, the concrete tanks, to accommodate those fish, acclimate those fish. That's the word I was looking for. So if they're raised at a different hatchery like they were at Coal River, they're brought into that water. That water is pumped through. And by the way, it's not Rock Creek water anymore. They're pumping water out of the North Umpqua because Rock Creek water has such bad. It's warm and it creates disease conditions, and occasionally they'll have most of a whole batch of hatchery fish wiped out by a disease. So they have to pump cold water in from the North Umpqua to make that even possible to rear those fish. So they they'll acclimate fish there. The other alternative is a full rebuild with all of the programs there. And what now is the no change alternative is just do nothing, save that money. It's going to, I don't recall how many millions of dollars it's going to take to rebuild that facility. But our argument is that money could be much better spent for, a myriad of other problems that we have here in Douglas County in particular, and Oregon in general. That we think that's going to be throwing good money after bad to rebuild that hatchery, which has not had stellar success over the last couple of decades because water quality has been so bad.
There's been a lot of blunders up there that that don't make it into the news review. So Stan Protowski, you've heard what Brother Carloni has said. What is your reaction to this? You're on the South Umpqua.
Well, first of all, Kevin, pleased to make your acquaintance. Our district just was hijacked by. We don't need to go there, but anyway,
it's too late now.
I wish I was there too. Trust me.
So there's a couple other variables here. One, now you have to understand the context of this comment is something to the tune of 15 years ago. I was chair of the Watershed Council. We took a tour up to Salt Creek power station dam area. Mm-hmm. And I happened to ask ODF&W, I said, well, what's it cost to bring one hatchery steelhead back into the system? And the quote then was $3,000 to bring one fish back. I want to affirm Ken's comments regarding the impact of the hatchery program. I think what we're dealing here with is with just momentum built on error. Functionally, scientifically, there's a plethora of academics, not just from Oregon, but worldwide, that have acknowledged that the hatchery programs are detrimental. They really are not solving the problem. Bonneville Power has spent something to the tune of, I don't know how many billion,
Yeah, it's billions.
with their hatchery program, and it has failed miserably. That being said, especially the Umpqua Basin is particularly challenged, not just with the loss, a reduction of steelhead, but Chinook salmon, etc. Richard, I don't know if we're going to bring up the issue of beaver ecology at some point here, but so I'll
Go
reserve
for
my
it.
comments.
If you don't, I will.
Okay, so when we look at the dynamic of ecosystem function, we have two keystone species, namely the anadromous fish and beavers, that have coexisted forever. And the state of Oregon is designating the beaver as a predator species.
I thought it was a
They're
nuisance.
considered predator.
A nuisance species.
No.
It's actually
Predator.
a predator on trees.
Predator species on private land, and a fur-bearing species on the public trust. And myself and a plethora of other very well-grounded academics throughout the state have gone before the Fish and Wildlife Commission and testified on several occasions. We really won't recover the salmon populations until we learn to interface with beaver ecology. So this is a major hurdle. We've been working on it forever. And really, any of the issues that have been brought up with regard to the beaver's status as a predator and a nuisance, we've addressed. There's plenty of solutions to the issue. So I think I want to, in particular, also bring up the issue of the spring Chinook run, especially in particular on the South Umpqua. In 2018, the returning number of salmon on the South Umpqua River was 28 adults in a run that most state biologists will say was something to the tune of about 5,000 fish when it
Historically.
was historically. But talking to tribal members from the Umpqua tribe, the elders at least, and it's anecdotal, but I want to give their information. They say the run was up to 12,000 fish. So we have a decline basin-wide for spring Chinook, summer steelhead, and most of the anadromous fish, not including the lamprey, the Umpqua Basin chub, which is indigenous to this basin only. We have a major decline going on, and frankly, the ODF&W is, and let me prelude my comment with saying that I have a good relationship with ODF&W, but it's one of the most dysfunctional, politicized agencies that I have ever had to deal with over the course of the last 20 years. It's so politicized, so controlled by the the politics, the polarization in the state, that it's rendered ineffectual. So that's my screed for now.
Well, I think the beavers are critical. You know, I'm involved in a little irrigation district, and we've discussed bringing back the beavers in headwaters because when they build a dam, the water they catch isn't just behind the dam, it soaks into the riparian area, and then all summer this cold water seeps out and provides summer flows. You don't need an EIS, it doesn't cost a dime. They do all the work, they're really good at it. And then in the summertime, when you find a beaver dam, you look behind it and it's just chock full of trout and steelhead and salmon smolt. And then when the winter floods come up, out they go. And years ago, old timers told me that they would string a clothesline over a beaver dam and they'd pick up roadkill and tie it on there and run it out over the beaver dam and go up there every couple of days and whang on the line, and all the maggots on the rotting animals would fall into the beaver pool, and the fish would be eating maggots, and they'd feed them. They were well aware of this relationship with the fish. And you know, this is the beaver state. I mean, the reason Western white people came to Oregon was to trap beavers. And I just don't understand the hostility towards that, and an obvious natural mechanism that, you know, we really don't have to do anything except let them flourish.
Some of the hostility there is that folks that grow trees for a living, and, you know, plant trees and plantations, consider the beaver to be predators on their trees, and so they, you know, they will chew the bark around young seedlings, and so I think a lot of the opposition to reintroducing beaver, and Stan, you know, you hear a lot more, you know, on your end of the grapevine than I do, but that there's a resistance from the tree planting industry, the timber industry, for having too many beavers eating their trees.
Well, they eat
there's another
hardwoods.
variable. There's another variable involved. One is, the real issue is that beavers are very intelligent, very capable of building dams right where culverts appear. So a big part of it, the big part of it is an infrastructure issue. We have solutions to those problems. We have devices that can be installed relatively inexpensively that would protect any infrastructure that conceivably could be damaged by beavers. Okay, all of these issues are addressed. I think Richard's right. We have a beaver on our flag. The first coin that was utilized in Oregon Territory was the beaver coin. It was a wooden coin with a beaver stamped on it. We know enough academically to understand that the real issues are strictly political. From an ecological standpoint, this species is absolutely quintessential to a lively fisheries in this state. And there are just a plethora of institutions globally that semi-annually meet in the state of Oregon to promote beaver ecology all over Europe, all over North America. And I just, again, it's Kevin, it's in your arena where this issue is really going to be settled.
Well, that's actually my first question coming up here is like how I asked the homeless board the other week is I see what we clearly are affecting is what's on our minds. But if, they say only bells can grant wishes, Tinker and Kevin. So what's your magic wand wish that I can grant for you?
Well, two things. One is to change the status of the beaver in the state of Oregon as a keystone to go from a predator status to a keystone species status. We have institutions in place right now that can address any of the infrastructures issues related to beavers. To give you an example, our Umpqua watersheds and also the South Umpqua Rural Community Partnership, which I'm a part of, we've been translocating beavers on our own dime in cooperation with ODF&W, moving so-called nuisance beavers from one place to another. The problem is we'll move a beaver to, say, onto national forest lands that we've analyzed and done habitat profiles on and all that. And we'll release them up there, but because they are fur bearer or predators, the $400 that we use to move a beaver from point A to point B is dead. So I think if we could change the status of the beaver to a keystone species, and there's the federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has done unbelievable amount of research related to this. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Marine Fisheries Service, there is so much documentation that it's actually embarrassing for the state of Oregon to keep the beaver in the status it's in.
I might just chime
So
in
I
real
would
quick.
say change. Please,
Go ahead, Ken.
Please,
Sorry,
do.
Zen, I was just going to say, as far as I know, Oregon doesn't have a designation of a keystone species. That's really an ecological concept, but they do have various levels of protection. And so if the beaver is afforded, some level of protection, even if it's a situation where ODF&W is looking at population levels, and if the population gets too high, then they can have a limited trapping season or something like that. But a level of protection from trapping, or just outright killing them if they're in plantations or threatening a culvert or something.
Well, actually, I
Right.
want to follow up on that in that these decisions are actually made by the Fish and Game Commission. So in terms of what you can do about it, Kevin, it's as the legislature, as a member of the legislature, is to work with the Fish and Game Commission to make these decisions, because that's where the decisions are made. So Bob Allen, you held your hand up. You wanted to make a comment? You have to unmute. You can do it.
Okay, I just do that? Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, it's a good segue for Kevin Bell. I hope before we end tonight that we will give him some concrete suggestions for policies and positions to take, and you'd be the expert on that, Richard, for him. But it's possible that we're going to have a Republican governor who's a hard ass, and that could be really bad. And so I hope before we leave tonight, we'll give him some positions, because the important thing is for him to get elected. And it's good for him to know these things, but he's got to be elected. And I hope we can also counsel him on what may be overkill if he takes sometimes positions in Douglas County that are good for us sounds good, but might just cost him the election. Just have to be really prudent. I think you're the most efficient counselor in that, Richard, for him. So good luck, Kevin. Hope you get something out of it.
Well, I was just going to go to Ethan and ask. He's been very patient. Ask him his opinion. Denise, you're an authority in water issues. Would you care to make a comment?
Richard, I'm actually not prepared right now to make a comment, but I'm enjoying listening to everybody's things, and if I come up with some other things to say later, I'll definitely contribute. So
Well, we always welcome your contributions.
thanks, appreciate it. But I appreciate listening to everybody else and what the recommendations they're making.
All right, then, since I've got my magic wand out and I've got your list, is I'll go down something I can work with, which is how does our climate and our fisheries affect our crops and our fish output at the end of each season? And how can we better prepare ourselves for better crops and better fish runs?
Oh golly, more water would be handy.
Amen.
And the other thing is that clean water too. I mean, a lot of the water that we have when I see the South Umpqua River, in the spring, this last year when we had a lot of rain, high green, beautiful. As soon as they started turning on the irrigation pumps, it's just like whoosh, the water goes away, and the rivers are over appropriated. The irrigators have so much water they can pump, but they turn those pumps on and they go for it, and they flush the fertilizers that they put on fields into the river. So now you have warm water full of nutrition, and then the moss and algae explodes. And so this is a very delicate topic when you start talking to farmers about maybe you should put on so much water. But I'm part of an irrigation district. We see people with big irrigation guns ka-chugga, 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 in the middle of the afternoon. You can see with your own eyes a third of the water evaporating. So this is an issue that we've tried to bring up in our little irrigation district, but this is across the spectrum. And driving up the South Umpqua, it's amazing the irrigation going on in the middle of the afternoon. They should do it at night. So anyway, that's and it has a direct bearing on the crops, whether that's hay or row crops or anything. And people need that water too. And there's the watershed doesn't deliver enough cold, clean water, and what gets in the river gets pumped out by irrigators.
Richard, can I speak to this one for a second?
Yes, you can.
So every county has a water master that
Right.
that regulates those in-stream water rights. However, our water master is now shared with 2 counties. It has been for the past few years. So she not only regulates in Douglas County, but also in Coos County. So I guess my point being is that at a time where we should really be having more people in the water master's office, there's actually fewer. And she also has a county employee working as well with her, but it's just something to be keep in your back of mind that these water issues aren't going to get any better, as Richard was mentioning, and the importance of having someone in the water master's office they're basically the eyes and ears on the ground. So how do they know all these situations like Richard was just mentioning unless somebody's out there measuring it? And so if you don't have the personnel to measure the flow, then it's never going to be accurately regulated without complaint, unless somebody calls and complains.
Well, this brings up a whole another set of issues about monitoring and measuring the water flow, which has been consistently downplayed. Now, you can talk to that, Stan, the monitoring and the lack thereof.
Well, it brings me to 2 specific issues. Number one, again, I hate to sound like a beaver groupie, but beaver ecology has mitigated climate for millennia. They address issues of flooding. They address issues of recharging aquifers. It's phenomenal what these flat-tailed rodents can do. Going back to the issue of irrigation, standards for irrigation are unbelievable. Number one, Richard will testify, they're still using water cannons on 90-degree, 100-degree days, where they're shooting water out of a cannon hundreds of feet. And I would venture to say that a third of the water never reaches the ground.
Yeah.
There are no standards when it comes to irrigation. Another really huge issue is all the entire Umpqua Basin is 303D listed by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for temperature.
What does
All
that mean?
along the riverbanks, all along the stream systems, all those areas need more shade. And then finally, the thing I would bring up is the USGS, the state of Oregon, various counties have a system of river gauges and temperature gauges throughout. And it is constantly under threat of being defunded. This is a really significant issue. If we don't have data, we have nothing. We're just vocalizing our passions versus really grounding ourselves in reality. So the river gauges are really significant.
And just like
So-
Denise said, they need more people to regulate that flow. Ethan, I saw a minute ago you had a question, your hand up if you'd like to.
Yeah,
ask
yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't have a question. I just, yeah, I got disconnected from this. My high-speed internet kicked me out like 2 or 3 times. But yeah, no, I didn't have any question. I was just listening. Pretty much getting your info.
Just want to make sure. Guess it's not that high
Yeah,
speed.
yeah. I was going to ask you if you had any comments or anything.
Yeah, no, I don't.
So
Sure.
this is Betsy. I have a couple of questions. In the last couple of months, there's a person, an activist who ran for county commissioner who has raised the issue of the problem with the Rock Creek fishery, but also the Winchester Dam. And then I saw an article, I believe, in the News Review within the last month about the Winchester Dam, and there's litigation over that to remove that. And then the person who was doing the research also talked about the glide sewer system and a problem with the water may not be treating properly. There seems to be a problem of DEQ permitting that there these local and even Roseburg are running on expired permits. I mean, doesn't that all play the role of, the quality of water as well as the temperature of the water and other things?
Well, I see Dane holding his hand up to ask a question, but before we go to you, Dane, we'll go to you next. But Ken, I want to pitch those questions that Betsy just raised about the suit over pulling out the Winchester Dam. Do you care to comment on that at all?
Yeah, the more or less the same group that's been focusing on the Rock Creek hatchery with a few additions and subtractions. A major addition being Water Watch, has been also looking at the Winchester Dam problem. It's a 130, 140-year-old dam. It was wood crib construction originally. Ran some kind of a mill. Nobody knows quite sure whether it was a grist mill or a sawmill. But the only 2 reasons in Oregon that dams are permitted for is irrigation and power generation. Winchester Dam does neither of those. It used to generate power for for some sort of a mill. For a short while, there were actually turbines in there that generated electricity until they started chopping up smolts, and that was discontinued. So now the only reason that dam is there is for recreation. And the Winchester Water Control District, that's the entity that literally owns that dam. It's the 100 property owners around the lake, around the reservoir there that own that dam, have pretty much either let the dam fall further into disrepair, or when they do repair it, they do so without the proper permits. And it was about 10 years ago, they drew down the dam to face the front of it with some membrane, and killed thousands of lamprey, ammocetes that when lamprey are young, they're filter feeders down in the gravel. And so the Winchester Water Control District has basically shined on DEQ rules and Fish and Wildlife rules, for mostly DEQ rules, for decades. And so we're finally holding their feet to the fire on that. Now, they just passed a $3 million levy among those 100 landowners to repair the dam, and their plan is to build a coffer dam behind that dam to hold the water back there. They're going to draw the reservoir down, put in a coffer dam so they can work on that dam to repair it. And one of the major problems with the dam where fish are concerned is that over toward the Winchester side, that big concrete OG that comes down near where the water gets taken out there for the city of Roseburg, that's built on bedrock, but the rest of but about the 2/3 of the dam from there over to the fish ladder is built on unconsolidated material. And so over the years, water has forced its way under the dam. And so there's water coming through the dam and under the dam, and that's the coldest water. And so that's where the salmon are going. They're trying to swim under the dam, they're trying to swim through the dam, and in the process, they're beating themselves up on broken concrete and rebar before they find the poorly designed fish ladder and make their way up through the fish ladder and over. So there is literally a take going on in the legal sense of the term there. And so what we've been saying to the Winchester Water Control District is either fix the dam and fix the fish ladder, or we will take it out, or we will raise the money to take it out. It's going to cost something like $8 to $10 million to take that dam out. But in order to properly repair the dam and put in a functional fish ladder, it's going to probably cost 10 times that amount. And Winchester Water Control District just raised $3 million to fix the dam. They're not going to fix the fish ladder, which again is difficult for the salmon to find. They beat themselves up on the face of that dam first before they finally find their way around the corner and up through the fish ladder. So we're not saying, we're not insisting, although Kirk Blaine's guest column that Betsy was probably referring to did finally actually step over that line. But what we're saying is fix it, or we'll raise the money to take it out.
Okay, listen,
Yeah, I'd like
Dane,
to comment on. I'd like to comment on that too.
sure.
It's on the top. It's on the top of the list of Oregon dams for unsafety. It is a disaster about ready to happen on monumental proportions. If it blows out, everything on the North Umpqua River and on the main stem is going to be hammered. And they've met none of the criteria, inspection criteria, repair criteria. It's phenomenal how they have gotten away with the potential disaster that dam is.
Who you know. So listen, Dane, you've been extremely patient and held your hand up, and so
No, I kind of put it in chat, Kevin. To me, because I live rurally, I live up in Yoncalla. We're on a personal water district for 11 families, and I've been up here 20 years. The first 10 years we produced all our own water, and then steadily, like that next 5 years, we started purchasing water. Now it's almost all purchased water. Our 4 wells are not producing enough to even sustain a month. And so that's a huge issue. And none of us can drill. I mean, that's at the level we're at, about 900 feet, most of the houses. To drill a well is going to be very costly. But if you have no water in your aquifer, and the 4 wells that are very deep wells are all like 400 to 500 foot wells,
wow.
that's going to be huge. I mean, it's very serious. I mean, we pay about 139 because we financed we thought the solution was going to be a new water tower financed with the USDA. You know, we got that tank in. It's 65,000. We've never been able to produce enough water to even get it, and we're having to buy water. And I believe that was reduced in the North County, just out of Oakland now, is the only where he can draw water to deliver, because it's the same delivery company that delivers most of up here. There's another gentleman that does some of it, but that's very concerning, and I think it needs to be heavy on everybody's radar. Is like, we're not the only ones buying water. Everybody up here in the North County has to buy water to sustain their drinking water, and that's a serious issue. Without water, we can't survive. And we don't have a garden. We can't irrigate, so we can't even have a well. I mean, a garden. You know, is that we're limited to about 3,000 gallons a month.
Yeah, it's a similar situation out in Olalla.
And in Glide, to be honest with you.
Well,
my grandparents have to do the same thing. So then Ken and Stan and old Richard, what's the solution? What can we do in the state to make sure households have their water? I mean, is it making sure the streams and estuaries are always filled? Is it doing something along those lines, or what's your take?
Get elected.
Well, I I was involved in reforestation for years, where we would go out and create these plantations. It was always a monoculture. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is look at restoring watersheds with multi-species and non-tree species. There's companions that go with the trees and things. So I think that's one thing to do. You got your hand up there, Bob Allen.
Suggestion is consider before or after Kevin gets elected is to have a water-based conference at UCC and invite the public, debate, and make it an issue that'll get a lot of publicity in Southern Oregon if there is a day-long conference on water issues sponsored by the college. That would work, I think.
Well, it is interesting that if that dam blew out, all the fancy homes from Amaker Park to the Forks are in real jeopardy. Then those are some connected people that are not real thrilled too. So, Ken, you got a comment?
Yeah, I was gonna comment on the fact that we've really got two major forks in the road here where water is concerned. On the one hand, we're talking about water in streams that can be utilized by irrigators, and the other thing is we have groundwater, like Dane's situation. And Stan has hit on this a couple of times, but I think that a strong beaver reintroduction program could help to capture that water up at the higher levels of the feeder streams, to allow that water to infiltrate into the aquifers, so that Dane's wells will have some water later on in the year. And then also, and Richard just brought up the issue of plantations, having a much higher, they had, even after there was a paired water, a couple of it was Julia Jones up at OSU, and and Perry was her co-sponsor. It wasn't Dave Perry, it was the other Perry. But anyway, and they found that even after 50 to 60 years in these paired watershed studies that were set up in the 1960s to look at the effect of clear cutting one watershed and leaving an intact forest on the other one, a primary forest. And they found that even after 50 to 60 years, summer low flows were half of what the primary forests were. And so those young plantations are very physiologically active. So they're pumping a lot of water into their crowns because they're growing really rapidly. And that water evaporates off the top surfaces of the needles and leaves of those trees. And so the one thing that hasn't come up yet in this discussion, and sort of a magic wand thing for me, and this is something that's very much in the control of the state legislature, is the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which is the set of regulations that regulate private industry in the state of Oregon. And our Forest Practices Act laws are the weakest of all. Even Idaho has stronger Forest Practices Act laws, or their Forest Practices Act are stronger than ours. And so I think that there's about a little over 50% of the timberland in Oregon is owned by the public, and a little less than 50 is owned by private land. But private land got all the best stuff. And so we did a quick back of the envelope calculation back when I was in graduate school a few years back, and figured that at least 70% of the productivity is in the hands of the industry. Okay, so as far as the volume, the fiber that gets put, that is created from those lands every year is far greater than the public forest lands, which are a lot of high elevation, a lot of steep ground, a lot of difficult terrain. And the reason it's public land now is because nobody wanted it back in the day when they had the gravy ground out along the the Coast Range and the foothills, the western foothills farther up in the valley and so on. So the clear-cut plantation forestry resembles nothing that ever happened in nature. You'll hear people say, "Oh, we're mimicking forest fires," but forest fires don't build roads. They don't put in culverts. They don't remove all of the. I mean, the most catastrophic fire, most of the carbon is still on that ground because most of it's stacked up in the trunks and the boles of those trees. And so the fact that all of those get removed, and then you short circuit what would happen naturally with succession, which we're going to see up the North Umpqua with the Archie Creek fire, because there weren't enough seedlings to replant all that ground. There weren't enough nurseries to grow enough seedlings to replant 1 million acres up and down, not just the Archie Creek at 140,000, but there was 1 million acres all told up and down the Cascades from the Labor Day fires. And so many of those forests, the federal forests in particular, will come back slowly year after year. Grass species, forbs, brush species, hardwoods, and eventually maybe 50, 60 years later, an uneven aged forest will replace those. But what we do now in standard plantation forestry is once we clear cut from one side to the other, and maybe leave 6 trees to the acre, or maybe not, depends on who's watching, and then we immediately plug seedlings in 10 by 10, we wind up with an even age stand, which were incredibly rare historically. And this is from, I can say this with some authority because I've looked at stumps, clear, when you cut across a stump and you can count the rings, you can count the fire scars. And so we know how often those forests burned, and we know how tree recruitment happened after each one of those fires. And so in the interior valleys here, almost none of our primary stands are even age stands. So we are not mimicking anything in nature when we do clear-cut plantation forestry. It's just the quickest way to turn a buck, because what you're doing is you're looking for the fancy term, the culmination of mean annual increment. Basically, what the bean counters are doing is they're looking at that curve and they're looking at right where that curve changes, and that's where you cut to make the most amount of money. And so that's what their actuaries are doing. And so that is not creating a forest, it's creating a series of fiber farms over and over again. And so pretty much all of the public land, I mean, with the like, there's like 2%, I think, of the public lands private lands are in primary forest. And a good 50% of the public forests are now in plantations. So, pretty much 3/4 of what burned up the North Umpqua were plantations at one stage or another. So that's one of the reasons that fire ripped as hard as it did, because there's nothing to, when all those crowns are even, they're all touching each other. A fire gets into the crown and it doesn't stop until, it hits an old growth stand, cooks half of that, drops down to the floor, creeps around there, hits the next plantation and runs again. So changes to the Forest Practices Act that would require less overstory removal every time an entry is made would greatly would help to reconfigure those plantations and make them more resilient to fire, and would make them less water pumps, pumping that water out of the ground. So to kind of circle back to the water question that you had originally, is trying to reconfigure those plantation stands into more uneven age stands and do more group selection harvest and individual tree harvest, will not only provide, benefits to wildlife, that are protected in one way or another, but also will produce more, will allow more water into the streams, and will decrease the risk of absolutely, stand replacing fires across the landscape.
It's also more jobs. So Stan, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I would comment that some years back, the League of Women Voters did an excellent survey on water utilization, and they have some interesting recommendations with regard to altering Oregon's current. If you don't irrigate, you stand the chance of losing your water right. And this is like so ridiculously archaic, it's not funny. There are solutions to that problem, but most of the public is not well informed in that regard. And I just want to affirm again what Ken just said. The plantations, I live in the middle of the Tillard Ranger District in Umpqua National Forest. I am surrounded by fire every year. And I can tell you that the BLM lands within reach, national forest lands, and especially industrial timberland, when those plantations go up, they sterilize the soil. They absolutely set back ecological function, mycorrhizal levels. It's when you talk about a scorched earth policy, that's it.
Because
We
the
really
the stands burn so hot, is that what you're saying?
They burn so hot. And what's interesting, and Ken can affirm this, when we had the Stouts Creek fire, 6,000 acres went up in 5 hours. When fires get that hot in these conditions, you're looking at setting back the biological clock on a scale that is. I also want to bring one other thing up. and this is tangentially related to the whole topic. That's OFRI, the
What is
Oregon
that?
Forest Resources Institute. Basically, it's an institution that is granted whatever tax dollars are available to represent the timber industry, is what it boils down to. The Oregon Forest Resource Institute. Kevin, it's really significant that the industry is not paying even a modicum of the taxes that they once did. And they are absorbing the ecological reserves of our landscape, and with no accountability whatsoever. They're not paying. And this is a huge issue. It affects the water. It affects ecological function from ridge top to ridge top.
If I can just
This is an
piggyback in
area
on that.
that can, please do.
Sorry, Stan, I thought there's enough of a delay. I thought you were done and I was going to jump in. Are you finished with what? Anyway, Kevin, I think, Stan brings up a good point with OFRI, that they are, getting tax dollars to basically promote the timber industry. But there are two, and he brought up an excellent point about the taxes that the timber industry used to pay up until, what was it, 96, Richard, when that changed?
Yeah.
And then the other thing about stiffening the Forest Practices Act. And what people have said to me when I've raised both those issues is they say, well, if you do that, people are just going to vote with their feet and they're going to move out of the state. And my thought is, and they're going to dig their forest up and take it with them. Somebody is going to cut, right? All the Forest Practices Act, Washington, Idaho, California are all stronger than ours, and timber products are being produced in all of those states. So you're going to hear that red herring that, oh, you're it's anti-industry, you're going to crush the industry, you're going to put these industries out of business. As long as there are trees growing there, somebody will be able to figure out how to do it, however the state of Oregon tells them how to do it, and they'll still be able to turn a buck. So they're not paying their fair share of taxes. They're getting a free PR agency through OFRI, and they're not taking care of their forests to the with the rest of the people of Oregon in mind.
It's driven by profit. But as I drive around, what I'm seeing in the woods, that I'm traveling in, tracts that have been held by families for decades and decades, generations, are being sold to out-of-state buyers who come in and clear cut, and the wholesale violations of the Forest Practices Act, and it's just done. And then reforestation is iffy. Seedlings, they're just grabbing seedlings that aren't necessarily the right ones for that area, or just not. And the State Department of Forestry is there to help them. But what I also see, a lot of the big companies that have been in here for a long time are selling out to real estate investment trusts. Roseburg Lumber is selling its land that's been burnt or logged to investment trusts, and what I also see is small mills popping up, not necessarily a two-man little tiny mill, but small milling operations where you have 8 or 10 people and they're doing specialty milling, and they're popping up now in Northern California, where they have much stronger rules. You don't see the giant mills. Now over at the coast you do, but they're small mills. They're all over the place. They're thriving. And a big mill, and big Roseburg Lumber Company mill, needs colossal volume to run, but it also takes huge amount of money to invest in the equipment that it takes for a big operation, where a small operation is much more economically feasible. And so I think the point that you raised, Ken, is really important, because that's the, oh, well, if you do that, the mills will pull out. Well, let them go. They're already pulling out. If they're Roseburg Lumber's moving to North Carolina. So adios, mofo, because there will be small mills take their place. And if you look around, many of these farmers and ranchers have got wood misers. And Ken, you've got a sawmill. It's economically feasible. And see, the other thing is, if you mill your own lumber, you don't pay taxes on it. And so I think that is a red herring. I think that as long as there is wood to be cut, there's going to be people trying to figure out to cut it. And if Georgia Pacific and Roseburg Lumber Company and these other outfits pull out, see you later. They're not putting the money back in the community. Listen, there's two hands up, but there's one more thing I want to say. This upfree, as a small woodland owner, I pay a severance tax. If any landowner over 5,000 acres does not pay a severance tax, it's the small under 5,000 acre managers who do, and that's the money that goes to the public relations outfit for big timber. The other thing is that they're exporting logs, and so to me, that ought to just be flat illegal. You cannot export a log. It's got to be a finished product, and let them scream. So, Stan, it's your turn.
Okay, yeah, I just bought my mill, Richard.
Oh, you're
you're
another sawmill owner.
But two things. One is, I think it's really significant. There's been a tremendous amount of research over the last, I would say, decade that has culminated into some really significant data points with regard to carbon storage in the forest. I can't emphasize enough, and I think when it comes down to it, the TIMOs and the REITs, their main concern is the bottom line. And we begin to put some value in the carbon that's being stored in these forests. I mean, real northwest corner of this country is one of the most valuable carbon storage regions in the world. And we start putting some actual value in the amount of carbon that's being stored, it's going to make a difference. And I think it's going to be, when they had the timber unity insanity going on in Salem, they tried to make it appear that the mills and the TIMOs and REITs were all in one camp. Well, up front they were, but behind the scenes, there was some serious negotiation going on when people brought up the fact that there could be some value to the carbon that's being stored. And I don't want to step out of my lane here, but Ken has a lot to say about biochar and the value of properly addressing the issue of mountains of byproducts from the timber industry that just go up and smoke.
You mean the slash?
Unmerchantable material, right? And before we move to that, let me just mention TIMOs and REITs, Timber Investment Management Organizations and Real Estate Investment Trusts, right? So they are secure. there are ways for Wall Street to securitize forests, and they're only managed for dollars. They're not managed for any other public interest or anything else. So TMOs and REITs, in case you all.
Well, and one other thing too, they're very popular in Oregon. You know why? Because our Forest Practices Act is such a piss poor, weak excuse for the rules. Okay, Bob. Now I'm starting to rave. It's your turn.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just rescuing you from a rave. I'll be brief. This is for Kevin. Go ahead, Ken.
I was going to get back to something that when Richard was talking a moment ago about log exports, that is no value added whatsoever. Logs cannot be exported from federal forests. Thanks to Peter DeFazio and others back in the day, back in the 80s. But logs from private lands can. And so every what was the number? I used to have that every million board feet is X number of jobs, right? I mean, so along with those round logs that are going overseas are jobs that could be adding value to those logs here. And so I remember bringing that up with Peter DeFazio at one point, and he said, "Oh no, can't deal with that because right in the Constitution it says that you can't abridge a state's ability to export, right? However, here's the solution to that, and this is at the state level, that you can tax exports." And so get a good chunk of that original tax money that we used to get up until the 90s. Put a fairly hefty severance tax on everybody, not just us little guys, right? And then rebate that tax money if those logs go to a local mill. And you could even have, like during the Depression, they used to have working circles, right? And so if you were within 100 miles, I think it was, of where the logs were harvested on federal land, you got a discount on those logs. But I think you can do it all with tax policy. You don't have to, you can say, hey, if it's worth it, if it's a 50 bucks $1,000 or something like that you put on it, if the difference between state logs and federal log. Okay, so if you're a log buyer and you're looking for logs, your private logs are worth more because you can export them. Federal logs get sold at a lower rate because they can't be exported. So if you put that higher level of tax on that timber in the first place, but then rebate it back if those logs land in an Oregon mill, that's a way to cut exports and bring those value-added jobs to Oregon.
Okay, Bob Allen, you were going to say something?
Right. I just want to move back to water for a minute, and this is especially for Kevin and Dane, if you're still listening, Dane. This is an old issue, and it may still be real. The county owns over 1,000 acres in Yoncalla. Yoncalla has always had a water problem. Drain does not have a water problem because Drain has the Billy Creek and Bear Creek Dam. And CH2M Hill, the engineering firm in Corvallis, they did a study which was hidden away by the county and thrown away, which showed that raising that Billy Creek Dam 10 feet would double the amount of water produced and more water than Yoncalla would need. And the county could pay for that by selling the 1,000+ acres they own. So it would be a win-win. So Yoncalla does have a water problem, but it's right in front of their faces. And one of the reasons it didn't work is that Yoncalla would never agree with Drain on anything, even sharing schools or sharing ice cream cones. They just wouldn't, but they could. So 1,000 acres the county owns, sell it, use the money to raise Bear Creek and Billy Creek Dam, providing a water source for Yoncalla. That was true 30 years ago. I'm very sure, unless something really has changed, that it's true today.
No, it hasn't changed, but as long as you brought up Yoncalla,
Yoncalla.
yeah, Yoncalla. That was 15, 20 years ago. There was an estimate there was over 1 billion board feet of federal timber was actually uh, exported through uh, ulterior sneaky means. There was an old mill site there in Yoncalla where they would, and I know cutters, guys that are falling timber, and they told me we're up in the national forest and we're cutting the China sort +2. So it's a 42-foot, they're cutting 44-foot logs. And then they'd run them up to Yoncalla, unload them, buck off a foot where all the staples and federal folderols on it, and then swap them with a mill in Washington for logs to come down here. And it's those switch and swap, and there's trucks running up and down I-5. And these federal logs then would get, then it cut off another 6-8 inches until they were 42 feet, and they would end up at Longview getting loaded on ships to go to China, Japan, and Korea. And it was flagrant for years. Murphy got busted. The Murphy company got busted for it. But it's been flagrant for a long time. So what has happened is they've curtailed the harvest of old growth and high end timber on the national forests and the federal timberlands. So that has been curtailed, but there's also movement afoot in Coos County for the Coquills to get the Coos Bay Wagon Road lands given to them for their management, which means they'll get clear cut and shipped. And so, but in terms of what a state legislator could do, I think that we've laid out a number of points here that I think, and I've often felt that the Fish and Game and Department of Forestry should be combined into a Department of Natural Resources, because they do not communicate. It's been lobotomized. When Oregon State was talking about, we'll take over the Elliott State Forest, there was not one word, not one single word about fisheries. It's all about forestry. Oh, we got forestry here. We're going to chop trees down up there. And when we're up here at the school, we know all about it. Not one single word in any of their manifest about how management affects the water quality and the fisheries. It's not in their vocabulary. They don't understand. They remain aggressively ignorant. And the result is the fish stocks are collapsing. So Kevin, we've been feeding you all kinds of information. What do you think?
Well, honestly, I've gotten a big list here. Just like Stan was saying, and you, of course, we're the beaver state. We need to change and protect our beavers so we can have better waterways, because they do a lot of it free of charge. We need more people on the actual ground. Instead of paying 8 hours for paperwork, they need 8 hours for water samples, 8 hours for taking temperature, 8 hours for actually doing the job. And just like you were saying, Richard, clean water, colder water, and better agricultural irrigation. These are things we can really work on and focus on. I mean, just getting, like how Robert was saying, a conference in Douglas County alone to talk about it so we can move the ball forward.
It would be interesting. Well, now they have this forest bridges too, which, I mean, I looked at that and thought, well, this is another public relations hocus pocus. Do you know anything about that, Ken?
I just a little over 2 weeks ago, I just got invited by Rick Sohn and his new executive director with Forest Bridges, and they're working on a series of principles of agreements, and I might get a chance to turn my comments around to them here in the next couple days, and then I'm going to be leaving for a gig I need to do on the East Coast. But what they're talking about doing is they're talking about some longer rotations. They're talking about no herbicide. This is strictly on BLM lands, nothing about private land. And the issue that I raised with them, and I said, what would probably be a deal killer for me to join, I think they would like me to be on their board of advisors. And that is that, and, you know, Richard and Bob and, you know, other activists have been through this before, you know, these collaboratives that get set up where they bring everybody together to try and, you know, solve these problems. And where BLM is concerned, they put up the map and every other square mile is white. The only color is on the public land. And the private land is not expected to do a thing for water, for species, for anything else. It all has to happen on the public lands. And so what I was saying to those guys is you need to double the amount of 400-year-old rotations that you're proposing on federal land to cover private land, which is only regulated by the flimsiest Oregon Forest Practices Act. And so that kind of like set him back, you know, and you know, but you know, these streams like go through all this colored square on a checkerboard, then they disappear and they appear over here on this other colored square. And everything that happens on that white blank square on the map doesn't count. And so that's got, you know, I say, if you guys are talking landscape level work, you need to work on the whole landscape.
Yeah.
So, you know, and the thing about it is where I was just, you know, talking earlier about the fact that plantations bear no resemblance to anything that happened in the past. You know, I mean, that, you know, there may have been 1% of the landscape that was in those kinds of even age stands. And so now they dominate the landscape. And so my, you know, my response, you know, to them is like, okay, we need to fix the forests that we've already messed up before we do anything to manipulate the primary forests that are here. Those primary forests, yes, it is true that those used to be more open stands when the Indians were underburning them every few years. Yes, they have more, there are more ladder fuels in there now. They are more flammable than they were, but nowhere near as flammable as the next door plantations are. So let's make our mistakes in the plantations. Let's do our learning in the plantations. Let's reconfigure those. Let's firewise our old growth stands by thinning back into those plantations so that we keep those things on the stump long enough that we can get through this reconfiguration process that's going to take a couple of generations going forward to do.
Interesting. The forest bridges is about how we're going to manage the BLM, but nothing about the private.
But nothing about the private land. Yeah. So I'm glad to critique their principles of agreement, and I'm glad to give them my advice if they ask for it. But
you know, I served on the Partnership for Umpqua Rivers for 15 years, and the industry was there, the agencies were there. Those guys are all getting paid, and I have a lot of respect for the agencies, but they're all on salary, and all of the citizens were out of our own pocket, and the industry was there just to slow everything down, put sand in the gears. And I mean, these long discussions about the definition of the word "as" or "shall." So it's just shall or must or kinda. And I mean, we would spend months and months and months going over the minutia of the language. Meanwhile, nothing really got done. And there was a lot of good on the partnership where they built fish-friendly culverts and did do a lot in the streams, but we were prohibited from discussing anything outside of the riparian areas where the timber guys would go hysterical. I don't know.
It just goes to show how much it is all interconnected. Well, this has been a good, pretty much 2-hour conversation so far, gentlemen, and I want to thank everybody in the audience and our participants for coming through. I have
Ethan,
a lot.
You're a good man. You were very patient.
Well, I've got a lot of, these are for me because I'm a young man and I should know it all. You guys are here to tell me because you're the professionals. You're the guys I need to talk to. I mean, I might be the leader, but you guys are the brains. I'm just the hands.
The brain cell, that's Stan and Carloni. I'm just an agitator. Okay,
Depends
well,
on
I
what brain
really,
cells you got.
I would second the thank you. It's been very enlightening. I'm really glad you tuned in, Stan. You have a lot to contribute. And I think, the simple thing is to talk about restoring the beaver.
Yeah.
When you can talk about restoring the beaver, that again, the beaver doesn't know who owns this land. They're just out there, catching water. The other thing that beavers do, and I've seen this a couple times, when there is logging and there is huge amount of erosion, the beaver dam catches the dirt and it does not go into the river. And if you know what you're looking at, I've seen several times on ranch properties that were listed for sale. In the creeks, there'll be a series of stair steps and kind of a curved front, and there'll be a little flat patch of soil in a curved front. That's where a beaver dam caught the soil. The beaver dam rotted away, but that soil is still there in the draw. And so the beavers have a huge impact on their environment. And like you say, they don't cost anything. And the solutions are there. It's well known, but not here at the state of Oregon, where we need some different legislators.
It's the bureaucracy at work. Don't we all love it? When I was
So
doing
any,
environmental work, DEQ was always up me. And so it's always good to talk about straightforward initiatives that honestly were really honestly straightforward in addressing the issues. And again, thank you all for coming. I am going to call it quits, guys.
Okay, thank you.
You know, do
So I'll go get a beer.
the sign
Bob.
thing on movies.
Say hi to Chris for me. Are we good, Betsy?